It begins like something out of a twisted suburban thriller, the kind of story you'd never imagine playing out in the quiet neighborhoods of Wisconsin, where the biggest scandal you'd expect might be a high school football rivalry or a city council debate over zoning laws. But in 2018, a case unraveled in the small community of Cottage Grove that would shake not only the town, but the true crime world at large. The woman at the center of it was Jessy Kurczewski, a caregiver, a seemingly ordinary woman whose job was to look after an older family friend, a wealthy woman named Lynn Hernan. From the outside, their relationship looked like the classic arrangement you see across America: someone older, financially stable, needing companionship and help, and someone younger, willing to step in as caretaker, assistant, and confidant. But what nobody realized was that this story wasn't about generosity or friendship. It was about greed, betrayal, and one of the most bizarre murder weapons ever brought to trial. On October 3, 2018, police responded to a 911 call at Hernan's home, finding the 62-year-old woman slumped in her recliner, a bottle of Visine eyedrops by her side, tissues scattered on a small table, and a scene that first appeared to scream suicide. The victim's home was staged with what investigators later described as an overdose tableau, a setup suggesting that Hernan had ended her own life with prescription medications and alcohol. It was the kind of tragic discovery police deal with regularly: an older woman living alone, struggling with health issues, possibly tired of the fight. But something about the scene didn't feel right, not to the paramedics, not to the detectives, and not to the medical examiner. Hernan was known as a generous woman, one who lived comfortably but not ostentatiously, with friends and neighbors describing her as optimistic and kind-hearted. Suicide didn't match her personality, and the way the scene was arranged looked almost too perfect, like a crime scene version of stage makeup. When the toxicology report came back, the puzzle became even more bizarre. Hernan had lethal levels of tetrahydrozoline in her system, the active ingredient in common over-the-counter eye drops. In small doses, it causes eye redness to disappear. In larger doses ingested orally, it can lower blood pressure, slow breathing, cause seizures, and eventually stop the heart. Poison by eye drops. The revelation stunned investigators because this wasn't a method that popped up in everyday homicide manuals. It wasn't cyanide. It wasn't antifreeze. It wasn't the usual poisons detectives are trained to look for. This was almost surgical in its obscurity, the kind of method you'd only know if you had researched it carefully or tested it. The deeper detectives dug, the more the spotlight turned onto Kurczewski. She had been the last person with Hernan, the one who found her, the one who called 911, and the one who just so happened to have access to Hernan's finances. And here's where the motive began to crystallize. Bank records showed that in the months leading up to Hernan's death, hundreds of thousands of dollars had been siphoned out of her accounts. Money meant for her future comfort was suddenly gone, redirected toward Kurczewski, who had been living far beyond her means. Investigators pieced together the story of a woman who had allegedly gained Hernan's trust, positioned herself as indispensable, and then exploited that trust in the cruelest way possible. To the police, it was no longer a question of suicide or natural causes. It was a clear case of homicide, a poisoning masked as self-inflicted tragedy, carried out with one of the most unsuspecting household products imaginable. What makes Chapter 1 so chilling isn't just the death itself, but the ordinariness of the weapon. Everyone has a bottle of eye drops lying around, on a bathroom counter or in a bedside drawer. The idea that something so mundane could be twisted into a silent, lethal poison is enough to make anyone double-check what's in their medicine cabinet. And so with one toxicology report, the narrative shifted from a simple call to a potential murder investigation that would stretch over years, culminating in a courtroom showdown where the phrase "death by eye drops" would forever be etched into America's true crime vocabulary. The moment investigators began to treat Lynn Hernan's death as suspicious, the story peeled back like the layers of an onion. revealing not just a single tragedy, but a pattern of deception that stretched far deeper than anyone could have guessed. At first, authorities thought they were looking at a caregiver who had taken advantage of a vulnerable friend. Finances, a classic case of fraud with a lethal ending. But as they retraced Jessy Kurczewski, steps in the weeks and months leading up to Hernan Auest's death, the details became darker, the paper trail heavier, and the lies more elaborate. Detectives learned that Kurczewski wasn't just dipping into Hernan's accounts. She was bleeding them dry, moving money around like a shell game and covering her tracks with forged checks, false explanations, and a charm offensive designed to make Hernan believe she was indispensable. It became clear that the poisoning wasn't just a sudden, impulsive act of desperation. It was the climax of a long, calculated scheme. Investigators sat with Hernan's closest friends and family members who recalled how the older woman had complained of feeling unwell in the months before her death, often chalking it up to stress or minor ailments. But when detectives began connecting the dots, it looked less like natural illness and more like the early stages of systematic poisoning. This was where the real horror crept in. The possibility that Kurczewski had been testing doses, slipping eyedrops into food or drinks over time, weakening her victim slowly until the final fatal amount. Forensic experts explained to the jury later how tetrahydrozoline works in the body, noting that the substance doesn't metabolize quickly, meaning repeated exposures can build toxicity. In other words, this may not have been a single drop in a glass one fateful night. It could have been weeks or months of careful administration, turning something as harmless as a glass of water or cup of coffee into a slow-acting time bomb. Detectives couldn't ignore the parallels to classic Black Widow cases, where caregivers or spouses poison their victims over long stretches, maintaining control while eliminating them inch by inch. The psychological element fascinated and disturbed criminologists who later studied the case. What kind of mind does it take to watch someone you know and claim to care about suffer day by day, all while pretending to nurse them back to health? The greed element was undeniable. Kurczewski was drowning in debt, desperate for money, and living beyond her means with purchases that seemed impossible on her actual income. But greed alone didn't fully explain the cold patience of the act. When police pressed her in interviews, she denied everything, often crying, playing the role of a devastated friend, insisting that Hernan must have taken her own life, pointing to the staged scene of pills and alcohol. But detectives weren't buying it, and they had science on their side. The toxicology report, combined with the financial motive, gave them what they needed to reclassify the case as homicide, and in December 2019, just over a year after Hernan's death, Kurczewski was arrested. News of the charges hit local media like a thunderclap. Death by eyedrops was a headline so bizarre, so unprecedented, that it traveled well beyond Wisconsin, making its way into national outlets and catching the attention of true crime junkies across the country. Yet the arrest was just the beginning, because the real battle was still ahead in court. Kurczewski's defense would be that Hernan had taken the substance herself, either intentionally or accidentally, and they pointed to the presence of the Visine bottle near her body as supposed proof. But prosecutors countered with an avalanche of evidence: the drained accounts, the forged checks, the suspicious medical symptoms, the implausibility of someone intentionally drinking enough eyedrops to cause death, and the cold fact that Hernan had never been suicidal, never expressed that kind of despair, and had every reason to live. To strengthen their case, detectives dug into Kurczewski's past, and while she had no prior homicide record, she had a history of financial misdeeds and manipulative behavior that painted her as someone willing to bend morals until they snapped. The prosecution also emphasized the calculated nature of the crime, how difficult it would be for an ordinary person to even conceive of using eyedrops as poison, let alone acquire the knowledge of dosage, method, and timing. This wasn't a reckless act of rage. It was premeditated, clinical, almost experimental. The more the state revealed, the more the public became obsessed with the case, because unlike so many homicides involving guns, knives, or blunt objects, this was a murder weapon that lived in plain sight in countless households, a reminder that evil sometimes hides in the smallest, most ordinary places. And as 2020 turned to 2021, and the world grappled with the pandemic, true crime fans found themselves returning to this story again and again, fascinated by its mixture of suburban banality and chilling ingenuity. It was a case that forced people to confront the terrifying thought that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the room isn't a stranger lurking outside your window, but the bottle of clear liquid sitting quietly in your cabinet, waiting for the wrong person to see it as opportunity. By the time Jessy Kurczewski sat in a courtroom facing the charges of first-degree intentional homicide, the case had already taken on a life of its own, becoming one of those rare stories where every new revelation seemed stranger and darker than the last, and the public could not look away. The trial opened in October 2023, nearly 5 years after the death of Lynn Hernan, and it was clear from the outset that prosecutors intended to hammer home one point above all. This was not a tragic accident or a desperate suicide. It was cold-blooded murder carried out by a woman who viewed her victim's bank accounts as her own personal lifeline. The prosecution wasted no time in outlining the mountain of evidence, presenting financial records that showed more than $290,000 siphoned away from Hernan, checks forged with Hernan's name, and testimony from friends who recalled how Hernan had spoken of Jessy with both gratitude and subtle hints of unease, like someone who wanted to believe the best in a person but had begun to notice cracks in the mask. And then there was the science, the undeniable toxicology that made this case so unusual. Experts explaining to the jury how tetrahydrozoline, a drug that almost no layperson would think of as deadly, became a murder weapon in the wrong hands. Forensic toxicologists detailed how the concentrations found in Hernan's system were hundreds of times higher than what could be explained by accidental ingestion, obliterating the defense's claim that Hernan may have taken it herself. Yet, the defense pressed forward, trying to paint Hernan as lonely, depressed, and struggling, leaning on the bottle of Visine found near her body as a symbol of intent. They called witnesses who suggested Hernan had spoken about her health declining and her fear of being a burden, but prosecutors swiftly dismantled these arguments by bringing in close friends who testified that Hernan was generous, kind, and optimistic, a woman who gave to charities, stayed connected with loved ones, and had never once given the slightest indication that she was contemplating ending her life. What made the courtroom drama so gripping was not just the evidence, but the way both sides fought over perception. Was this a grieving caregiver scapegoated by the state? Or was it a cunning manipulator who had engineered one of the strangest murders in modern history? Jurors leaned in as prosecutors painted Jessy as a woman with champagne tastes and no money to back it up, someone who saw in Hernan a solution to her financial ruin, a target to exploit until there was nothing left. The state showed receipts for lavish spending, vacations, and luxury items that Jessy could never have afforded on her salary alone, each item a breadcrumb leading back to Hernan's accounts. And then there were the chilling details of the crime itself, how investigators believed Jessy had been experimenting with the eyedrops, administering smaller amounts before finally delivering a fatal dose, all the while pretending to care for the woman she was slowly killing. The public followed every twist, not just through local coverage, but through national outlets and true crime podcasts, which latched onto the surreal phrase, "death by eyedrops," as if it were pulled from the script of a dark Hollywood thriller. Even seasoned courtroom reporters admitted they had never seen anything quite like it, a trial where the weapon was as ordinary as it was sinister. And when the jury finally deliberated, after weeks of testimony and days of arguments, their verdict was decisive: guilty of first-degree intentional homicide and 2 counts of theft, sealing Jessy Kurczewski's fate with a mandatory life sentence. The moment the words were read, the courtroom fell silent, except for the muffled sobs of those who had loved Lynn Hernan, people who had waited 5 long years for justice, People who had endured the indignity of seeing her death painted as a suicide when they knew in their bones she had been taken from them by someone she trusted. For them, the verdict was vindication. But it was also a brutal reminder of the fragility of trust, of how a seemingly loyal caregiver could become the ultimate predator. Outside the courtroom, the story continued to ripple across the media, with headlines playing up the strangeness of the weapon and legal analysts pointing out how rare it was for a poison case like this to actually reach conviction, given how difficult it often is to prove intent and method beyond a reasonable doubt. But in this case, the combination of toxicology, financial motive, and behavior created a puzzle that snapped together too perfectly to ignore. What lingered most, and what gave the story its staying power, was the sheer ordinariness of the tool. A few drops from a plastic bottle that millions of people keep in their homes, transformed into a silent executioner. The idea that a substance designed to soothe could be twisted into a method of murder left a chill long after the courtroom doors closed, and it ensured that the name Jessy Kurczewski would forever be linked to one of the strangest, most unsettling true crime cases of the decade. As the verdict reverberated across Wisconsin and beyond, people began asking the deeper question: how does someone like Jessy Kurczewski get to this point, and how do the red flags slip past until it's too late? To understand the eyedrop murder, you have to look not only at the crime itself, but at the psychology that underpinned it, the slow burn of desperation, entitlement, and manipulation that built up over years before exploding into homicide. Investigators pieced together a timeline that revealed Jessy wasn't here and simply living paycheck to paycheck. She was perpetually in over her head juggling debts, borrowing money she couldn't pay back and crafting a lifestyle that looked stable from the outside but was rotting underneath. Friends described her as someone who often spun stories, exaggerating her circumstances, playing the role of caretaker, while subtly shifting herself into positions of control. The kind of person who could disarm you with friendliness, even as she was tightening her grip on your trust. Her nan, generous to a fault, had extended her support financially and emotionally, likely believing she was helping a struggling friend. But what she didn't see was how Jessy was weaponizing that generosity, turning it into a dependency that ultimately left her nan vulnerable. Prosecutors later argued that what made the crime especially chilling was not just the theft or the poisoning, but the fact that Jessy continued her double life so convincingly, projecting herself as devoted caregiver while quietly orchestrating the slow erosion of her nan's health. The psychological toll of poisoning is unlike other forms of homicide. It requires patience, detachment, and a willingness to watch suffering unfold in real time. Some criminologists call this compartmentalization, the ability to wall off empathy in one part of the brain while pursuing self-interest in another, a trait often found in fraudsters, con artists, and certain types of killers who rely on trust as their greatest weapon. In Jessy's case, the poison wasn't only in the eye drops, it was in the lies, the constant insistence that she was a friend, a caretaker, a protector, when in reality she was an executioner in plain sight. Detectives who worked the case spoke later about the difficulty of proving intent in poison homicides, how often suspects claim ignorance or accident. But they emphasized how everything about this case pointed to calculation. The staged suicide scene was perhaps the clearest tell, the way Jessy had arranged the room to mimic an overdose, with pills and alcohol positioned deliberately, as if she were directing a play. It takes forethought to stage death, to assume how police will interpret a scene, and that forethought became the prosecution's strongest weapon. True crime followers couldn't get enough of this psychological angle, dissecting not just the act, but the personality behind it, speculating on whether Jessy A.'s motive was purely financial, or whether she also derived some twisted satisfaction from the control. Some pointed out how her behavior after her nan's death seemed more performative than grief-stricken, with crocodile tears in police interviews. Others latched onto the bizarre uniqueness of the weapon itself, noting how tetrahydrozoline had appeared in scattered reports over the years as a potential poison. but had rarely been tested in court, making this case a landmark in forensic toxicology. And behind all of it, the community of Cottage Grove was left with a wound that cut deep. Not just the loss of her Nan, but the betrayal that it came from someone she trusted. Neighbors who once waved at Jessy across driveways now shuddered at the thought that they had brushed shoulders with a killer, a woman who smiled and chatted about ordinary things while plotting the extraordinary crime of murder by eyedrops. When the sentence of life without parole was handed down, it was both an ending and a beginning, the end of Jessy's freedom, but the beginning of her place in the dark lore of American true crime, a story that would be replayed in podcasts, documentaries, and late-night conversations as people tried to comprehend how far someone could go when trust is weaponized and greed becomes insatiable. It was a chilling reminder that some of the most terrifying predators don a tee, lurk in alleys or forests, but sit across from you at the kitchen table, blending in so perfectly you never see the danger until it's too late. By the time the trial wrapped up and the public had time to digest the strange and unsettling details of the case, the conversation began to shift from what happened to what it meant, because this wasn't just a story about one woman's greed or one victim's tragic end. It was a case that exposed gaps in how we think about crime, how we detect it, and how we protect the vulnerable. Poison as a weapon has always fascinated criminologists, stretching back to Victorian arsenic murders and the antifreeze killings of the 20th century. But what made the eyedrop murder stand out was the accessibility and invisibility of the weapon itself. Unlike a knife or a gun, which leave obvious marks, or even common poisons like ethylene glycol, which show up in toxicology screens more predictably, tetrahydrozoline sat in a blind spot for years, tucked away on pharmacy shelves as something designed to soothe, not kill. For investigators, this case was a wake-up call that even the most ordinary household products can be repurposed in ways the public rarely considers, and for the true crime audience, it sparked a wave of paranoia about what we ingest, who prepares it, and how easily trust can be weaponized in daily life. The prosecutors made sure to emphasize during trial that this wasn't a one-off fluke, that the pattern of symptoms her Nan exhibited leading up to her death, drowsiness, fatigue, confusion, slowed breathing, lined up almost perfectly with documented cases of tetrahydrozoline poisoning, and that had medical staff or friends recognized those warning signs earlier, intervention might have been possible. That realization sparked wider debate because poisonings often slip under the radar, dismissed as illness or natural decline, which means cases like Hernan A.S. may not be as rare as we think. They were just harder to catch. In the aftermath, forensic science circles began discussing whether routine toxicology screenings should expand to include substances like tetrahydrozoline, a step that could save lives, but also comes with costs and complexities, since not every lab is equipped to detect obscure compounds without specific requests. And then there was the cultural impact. Media outlets and podcasts latched onto the phrase, "death by eyedrops," because it was so surreal, so easy to remember, that it spread like wildfire. But behind that catchphrase was a haunting reality. A woman who trusted her caregiver, who thought she had a friend in her corner, died because that trust was exploited for money. That element of betrayal struck a chord across communities, particularly among older adults, and their families, because it highlighted the vulnerability of people who rely on others for care, whether due to age, illness, or disability. Advocacy groups began citing the Kurczewski case as an example of elder exploitation at its most extreme, using it to push for stronger oversight, background checks, and education around financial guardianship. Even law enforcement acknowledged that part of what allowed Jessy to operate unchecked for so long was how normalized her role was. She wasn't a shadowy intruder, she was the friend, the helper, the person who seemed above suspicion. That camouflage is what made the crime so insidious, and it's also what made it resonate with the public long after the gavel came down. Because if poison is the weapon of the patient killer, trust is the cloak they wear, and in this case, Jessy wore it well until science ripped it away. The lasting question became not just, how did she do it, but how many others out there are doing something similar, hidden under the mask of caregiving, hiding their greed behind a smile. It was a thought that kept people up at night, turning a local Wisconsin tragedy into a cautionary tale with national weight, proof that sometimes the smallest bottle on the shelf can conceal the darkest intentions. If Chapter 5 peeled back the cultural ripples of the case, Chapter 6 dives into the forensics because what ultimately brought Jessy Kurczewski down wasn't a confession or a witness who saw her slip eye drops into a drink. It was the science, the invisible trail inside Lynn Hernan's body that told the truth no matter how carefully the crime scene had been staged. Toxicology has long been one of the quiet heroes of true crime, the discipline that turns blood, urine, and tissue samples into smoking guns. And in this case, it was the precision of toxicologists that exposed the murder method. When Hernan's body was first examined, the coroner noted nothing glaring, no bruising, no gunshot wounds, no signs of trauma. So the initial suspicion leaned toward suicide, especially with the pills and alcohol nearby. But the toxicology panel changed everything. Forensic scientists detected astronomical levels of tetrahydrozoline in her blood, a concentration so far beyond therapeutic or accidental range that it eliminated any reasonable doubt about intent. To put it into perspective, medical experts explained that just a few milliliters ingested can cause dizziness or fainting. But Hernan's levels suggested repeated ingestion over time or a single massive dose, both scenarios inconsistent with a woman who had never before indicated any knowledge or desire to self-administer something so obscure. What made the case remarkable is that tetrahydrozoline isn't a part of every routine screening. It has to be looked for specifically. And in this case, the persistence of investigators pushed the lab to dig deeper when the standard panels came back unusual. The discovery set off a chain reaction. Once the substance was identified, detectives began cross-referencing symptoms Hernan had displayed before her death, and suddenly the puzzle snapped together. Friends recalled how she complained of fatigue, sudden dizziness, nausea, and a general fogginess that seemed out of character. Doctors who saw her in the months leading up to her death had chalked it up to stress or aging, but in hindsight, those symptoms lined up almost perfectly with low-level poisoning. This retrospective realization added a chilling layer. The likelihood that Jessy had been testing dosages, experimenting with small amounts before escalating to the fatal dose, making her not just a killer but a calculated one. The science also reinforced the staging of the crime scene as deliberate deception, because if Hernan had truly wanted to end her life, she had far easier, far more predictable means at her disposal. The fact that the poison came from eye drops, and that such an amount was required to be lethal, made the suicide theory almost laughable under scrutiny. Prosecutors leaned heavily on this in court, bringing toxicologists to the stand who testified with absolute clarity that the substance was present in lethal concentrations, that the ingestion could not have been accidental, and that the source was almost certainly repeated administration by someone else. The jury, already wary of the financial motive, now had the cold precision of science to pair with the emotional betrayal, and the combination was devastating for the defense. This chapter in the story is what hooked forensic circles and crime scientists most, because it was proof of how careful analysis, attention to anomalies, and persistence can uncover truths that a killer believes are buried forever. It was also a warning that everyday substances might demand more attention in forensic labs, because the line between household product and murder weapon isn't always as clear as I'd like to believe. In the aftermath of the trial, toxicologists wrote papers and gave lectures using the Kurczewski case as an example, showing students and peers how unusual poisons can slip past if investigators don't widen their lens. And for the public, hearing scientists explain in plain terms how eye drops can literally stop the heart made the story feel all the more surreal, because it shattered the illusion of safety we associate with over-the-counter products. The very thing people keep at their bedside for minor irritation was turned into a tool of control and death, and it was science, cool and clinical, that stripped away the mask of accident and revealed the hidden truth. Chapter 7 is where the investigation into Lana Clayton's actions took on a life of its own, morphing from quiet whispers among neighbors into a national obsession as reporters, true crime junkies, and legal analysts all began to dissect the case piece by piece, each trying to understand what kind of person would choose such a bizarre, almost cinematic method to kill. Unlike more traditional cases of spousal homicide, guns, knives, blunt force trauma, the eyedrop poisonings carried with them a strange sense of both subtlety and cruelty, as if the very choice of Visine as a weapon reflected something deeper about Lana's state of mind. Investigators leaned into this angle heavily, exploring not just her behavior in the immediate aftermath, but also her broader psychological profile, noting that people close to her described her as charming, intelligent, but often volatile, a combination that had left many wondering if she had long been capable of hiding dangerous impulses behind a polished exterior. Forensic psychologists brought into the courtroom later on would describe the poisonings as a calculated act rather than a crime of passion, a slow-motion murder that required planning, patience, and an ability to manipulate appearances while her husband's health deteriorated in plain sight. The media latched onto this theory, portraying her in headlines as a femme fatale-type character, someone who had turned a benign household item into an assassin's tool, a story so unusual that even seasoned reporters admitted it stood out in a sea of other homicide cases they covered. It was around this time that more disturbing questions started to emerge. Was this the first time she had poisoned her husband? Or had there been earlier attempts that went undetected? Had she experimented with dosages, testing how much was needed to make him sick without killing him outright? These darker speculations gave the case a new layer of intrigue, sparking endless debate among crime forums and social media feeds, where amateur sleuths picked apart every available detail, trying to piece together a motive that seemed to shift with every new revelation. Some pointed to greed, since Lana inherited a large portion of her husband's estate after his death, while others thought it was resentment, a pent-up cocktail of marital tension, jealousy, and long-term dissatisfaction that finally boiled over in an act she may have convinced herself was justified. Still others speculated that Lana was driven by something less tangible, a craving for control, or the thrill of seeing how much she could get away with, which would explain why she appeared so composed and unconcerned during the weeks when her husband was visibly ill. As the investigation deepened, detectives unearthed evidence that suggested Lana had been actively searching for ways to cover her tracks, including attempts to manipulate medical explanations for her husband's decline, as if she believed she could outsmart not just the doctors, but the entire legal system. Yet no matter how elaborate her concealment strategy, the forensic proof was damning, and the longer the story stayed in the public eye, the more it became clear that what had started as a bizarre local case was now a national parable about trust betrayal and the unsettling realization that danger can come not from a stranger in the shadows, but from someone sleeping in the same bed. This was the heart of Chapter 7. The blending of media sensationalism, legal analysis, and human psychology into a swirling storm of narratives that made the case impossible to ignore, a story that seemed to embody the phrase, "Truth is stranger than fiction." As the courtroom drama evolved, attention turned to the financial web that Jessy Kurczewski had spun around Lynn Hernan, because the crime was never just about poison. It was about control, leverage, and the slow extraction of wealth under the guise of friendship and care, a theme that became more pronounced the deeper prosecutors dug into the months leading up to Hernan's death. Bank records revealed a series of transactions so carefully orchestrated that it seemed almost cinematic. Withdrawals timed to avoid alerting the bank transfers disguised as routine payments, and subtle manipulations that made Hernan believe she was still in control while her resources were drained. Friends and family were interviewed extensively, painting a picture of a woman, her Nan, who had always been generous, trusting, and perhaps too willing to believe in the best intentions of others, traits that Jessy had exploited with surgical precision. The prosecution emphasized the pattern of deception, presenting emails, texts, and handwritten notes that showed Jessy coaching her Nan on where to sign, how to approve payments, and even suggesting helpful ways to manage her finances, all while systematically rerouting funds to herself. Psychologists called in to testify described this as a textbook example of manipulation, noting that Jessy's behavior was not impulsive but premeditated, rooted in both opportunity and an acute understanding of her Nan's vulnerabilities. The financial aspect was intertwined with the forensic evidence because it wasn't just about killing her Nan, it was about doing so in a way that maximized gain while minimizing risk, a slow, calculated extraction culminating in the administration of a lethal dose. During the trial, jurors were presented with charts, timelines, and flow diagrams that laid out the financial trail in stark terms, making it impossible to view the case as anything other than deliberate. Media coverage amplified the narrative, highlighting how the combination of poison and financial theft created a story that was almost too bizarre to be true. A woman turning a bottle of eye drops into a weapon while simultaneously orchestrating the depletion of her victim's wealth. True crime enthusiasts dissected every angle online, discussing the psychology of white-collar killers who combine financial greed with homicidal tendencies, while legal analysts debated how often these cases go undetected because the weapon is unassuming and the financial misdeeds can be masked as normal activity until the end. Meanwhile, friends of her Nan began to share their personal stories, recounting moments that, in retrospect, seemed like warnings, hesitations, subtle signs of discomfort, fleeting expressions of doubt about Jessy's intentions, moments that might have been missed in the rush of daily life but now appeared as prescient signals. Experts also noted the symbolic cruelty of the crime. To poison someone with something designed for healing or relief, to slowly siphon their life and wealth while maintaining the appearance of care demonstrated not just intent, but a particular kind of psychological thrill that some killers derive from deception itself. The courtroom in those months became a theater for examining this rare intersection of mundane items, weaponized into instruments of death. The slow unraveling of trust and the exploitation of generosity and care, offering jurors, media, and the public a lens into the chilling mechanics of modern predation. And while the sentence would ultimately hold Jessy accountable, the broader conversation about elder abuse caregiver oversight and the potential for ordinary objects to become lethal tools lingered in the national consciousness, making Chapter 8 not just a retelling of evidence, but a study of human vulnerability, moral blindness, and the terrifying fact that sometimes the people we trust most are capable of the darkest betrayals imaginable. By the time the final weeks of the trial arrived, attention had shifted from evidence and testimony to the human drama that had been quietly unfolding in the shadows of the case. Because while the science and financial trails were compelling, what gripped the public most was the story of Lynn Hernan herself. Her generosity, her trust, and the way her life had been quietly stolen by someone she had welcomed into her home, someone she believed would care for her until the very end. Prosecutors painted a vivid portrait of Hernan's final months, recalling the small changes in her routine, the moments of fatigue that friends had initially shrugged off, and the subtle manipulations that Jessy Kurczewski employed to make her seem indispensable, to convince Hernan that she was both needed and protected, all while the poison silently built to a fatal crescendo. Experts in elder abuse and criminal psychology weighed in during court, explaining how this case exemplified a rare but growing phenomenon: the exploitation of trust combined with unconventional methods of murder in which killers exploit familiarity and everyday items to achieve their goals. Jurors listened as forensic toxicologists walked them through the mechanics of tetrahydrozoline poisoning, describing how the compound disrupts cardiovascular and respiratory function, how repeated small doses can slowly weaken a person's system, and how the subtle symptoms can easily be misinterpreted as age-related decline, stress, or minor illness, which allowed the killer to operate under the radar for weeks or months. Witnesses recounted what they had observed in Hernan's home, from curious changes in behavior to unexplained health issues, painting a picture of a woman whose declining vitality was visible to those who cared enough to notice, but invisible to those who believed her death would be accidental. The financial evidence combined with the toxicology became the central narrative thread of Chapter 9. Demonstrating not only the planning required to execute the crime, but also the cold calculation of a killer who understood how to manipulate appearances to their advantage. Prosecutors emphasized the uniqueness of the weapon and the meticulous nature of the crime, pointing out that the method itself was virtually unheard of, which meant that Jessy had either researched her approach extensively or discovered it through experimentation, underscoring the deliberate premeditation behind every decision. As the defense tried to suggest alternative explanations, suicide, accidental ingestion, or even negligence, they were systematically dismantled by the mounting evidence, leaving jurors with a stark choice: accept a manufactured narrative of self-harm or confront the reality that Hernan had been murdered by someone she trusted implicitly. Media coverage during this phase of the trial amplified every revelation, from the bizarre nature of the weapon to the financial exploitation, feeding a national fascination with a story that combined elements of high-stakes fraud, intimate betrayal, and the kind of clever, almost clinical criminal method that true crime audiences couldn't help but dissect endlessly. The emotional weight of the case was underscored in court by statements from Hernan's family and friends who described her as vibrant, generous, and unsuspecting of danger in her own home, a woman whose life was stolen not by an unknown predator, but by someone she had embraced as family. Analysts and commentators noted that Chapter 9 of this narrative, the trial's emotional and evidentiary climax, offered a rare convergence of human tragedy and forensic ingenuity, a case study in how the ordinary can be weaponized and how trust can be transformed into a deadly liability. The cumulative effect on the jury and the public was overwhelming, creating a sense of inevitability as the story moved toward its conclusion, yet leaving lingering questions about how often similar crimes might go undetected, how many everyday products could be misused in ways we never consider, and how the combination of psychological manipulation, financial exploitation, and unconventional poisoning could create a uniquely chilling modern murder. Chapter 9, in essence, was about reflection on motive, method, and the terrifying reality that even in the safest-seeming environments, danger can exist behind the facade of ordinary life, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, leaving behind a story that would haunt the public imagination for years to come. The moment the jury read the verdict, life in the courtroom seemed to freeze. A collective breath held as the reality of justice, or perhaps retribution, settled over everyone present, because what had begun as a bizarre, almost surreal case of death by eyedrops had evolved into a cautionary tale about trust, greed, and the fragility of human perception, reminding the public in stark, unforgettable terms that evil can hide behind the most ordinary masks, in the most ordinary places. Jessy Kurczewski, once the smiling caregiver, the friend who shared stories, meals, and laughter, was now condemned, stripped of freedom, and defined by her actions in the minds of jurors and the nation alike. While Lynn Hernan's story, the woman who had been generous, trusting, and unsuspecting, was finally given its full weight, her life honored through the relentless pursuit of truth and the meticulous weaving of evidence that exposed every layer of deception. Across media outlets, headlines screamed the surreal nature of the crime. True crime podcasts dissected the minute details for audiences hungry to understand how such a murder could happen. and criminologists examined the unique psychological and forensic aspects, dissecting the manipulation, the patience, the financial exploitation, and the deliberate experimentation with a household product to achieve a lethal end. Yet beyond the science and sensationalism lay a deeper, almost philosophical reflection. The case forced society to confront the uncomfortable reality that ordinary objects can become instruments of death, that kindness can be weaponized, and that the people we let into our lives are not always who they seem. Families across the nation, especially those caring for elderly loved ones, felt a chill run through their own daily routines, wondering how closely they were watching, how much trust they were placing, and whether subtle signs of danger could be missed until it was too late. Legal experts hailed the case as a landmark, not just for the uniqueness of the murder method, but for the combination of financial fraud and homicide, pointing out that the meticulous financial trail paired with precise toxicology evidence made conviction almost inevitable in a world where proving intent in poison cases is notoriously difficult. And yet, for all the analysis charts and courtroom testimony, the public eye's fascination was driven as much by the human drama as the forensic triumph. The betrayal of someone who was supposed to protect the slow, deliberate erosion of trust, and the eerie idea that a seemingly innocuous bottle of eye drops could serve as a silent, invisible executioner. In the aftermath, the Kurczewski case inspired debates about caregiver oversight, elder protection laws, and the necessity of vigilance in financial and personal relationships, while true crime enthusiasts and casual viewers alike returned repeatedly to the story, drawn to its perfect storm of psychological manipulation, methodical cruelty, and the sheer unpredictability of the weapon. In homes, classrooms, and offices, people whispered the term death by eye drops, with a mixture of disbelief and morbid curiosity, a phrase that would forever encapsulate the unnerving fusion of ordinary life and extraordinary crime. And so Chapter 10 closes not just on the resolution of a trial, but on the enduring impact of a story that shocks, educates, and haunts in equal measure. A story that reminds us that evil does not always announce itself, that sometimes it creeps in quietly disguised as trust, necessity, or care, waiting for the perfect moment to claim what it seeks, leaving behind a trail of grief lessons, and a nation forever altered in its understanding of vulnerability, human behavior, and the unsettling truth that even in the simplest objects, danger can be hiding silent, patient, and deadly.